Warning. Very, very full presentation. Known for it anyway, and working with Abby seems to have appreciably made that worse, so we'll try and stick to our time. So, African Journals Online is an aggregator of peer-reviewed scholarly research journals published on the African continent. We have 462 or 63 partners at the moment from 31 different countries. And we're frequently asked to stand up on behalf of scholarly publishing in Africa at various international gatherings. And in part because of this, and in part because we had the hypothesis that open access in the African contexts is complex and in some ways different from that in the global north, we decided to do some rigorous research into the situation of scholarly publishing on our continent. We're quite careful about not making it specifically about open access. So it was generalized towards scholarly publishing. So we weren't kind of gearing one way or the other the responses. AJOL decided to work with Abby Clobridge of Clobridge Consulting. We didn't really want to work with any particular university with possibly vested interests on the continent. And also Abby and I met at the Publishers for Development conference last year when I dropped some of my tea on her foot. So it's a nice link to be presenting the very preliminary findings of our work today. So I'm going to hand over to Abby now and then talk to you some more after her slides.
Okay, I'm going to talk just a bit about the data that we've collected and the survey and the process. We really just started this. Susan already mentioned this is preliminary, and just to give you a sense of how preliminary, the survey started at the end of August and we closed it in early September, so we've only had data for a couple of weeks at this point. We're planning on moving into phase 2 at the end of this year to follow up with a couple of specific topics that came up in the survey that we wanted to be able to dive into a bit more deeply. And we'll be planning, or we're going to be publishing a full report right now scheduled for early 2014. And funding was in part from Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Swedish International Development Agency. So to get things going, we sent out about 1,200 emails to journal editors that we identified through various channels. We were offering the survey in both English and French. We were offering and encouraging people to fill out the online survey, but we did have an offline version as an alternate if that was requested. The source of getting people to actually fill out the survey, what worked the most was encouragement from either a publishing organization or an agency organization that the editors were used to working with, such as PKP or INASP or AJOL. That really triggered responses more than anything else. We also sent out a bunch of listserv messages and other invitations. So we got about 330 responses. Most of them were, sorry, I'm looking at this. Most of the journals, I'm not sure what the first bullet point is, most of the journals were journals that we had identified, but about 10% of the responses were from journals that were new to us. Some of them were new journals that are just starting to become published. Some were journals that we didn't know about from any of our channels. We heavily relied on Ulrich's, DOAJ, PKP's open journal system lists, and a few other ways that we were trying to aggregate the information about which journals were being published in Africa. But we ended up with a bunch of duplicates, we ended up with a bunch of journals with slightly different names, we ended up with journals that had 3 different names and only one of them was accurate or current. And so it was a little bit difficult actually trying to put together this pool. But we did manage to get responses from 32 countries. South Africa and Nigeria were by far the countries that we had the most responses from. But I thought it was really interesting that we also had 18 responses from Ethiopia, 13 from Ghana, 13 from Kenya. We were expecting a number from Egypt as well, so that was less of a surprise to us. All of the countries that are listed here had some responses, but those were the ones we wanted to highlight. We had a pretty expected bell curve of the date range of the year of birth from people who participated. And the gender breakdown was A little sad to us, but fairly expected that about 3/4 of the people who responded were male. We have a lot of data, and I'm going to go through some of these slides pretty quickly. We really just wanted to put them in here so you could go back to them and look at them in more detail later if you wanted. So I'm just going to pick out a couple of things from each point. Most of the people who responded were affiliated with the university in some form or another, faculty member, lecturer. But we did have a number of people who were working as a journal editor or as a journal manager. And we were specifically targeting editors-in-chief, and most of the people who responded were indeed. The breakdown for subjects was pretty much what we were expecting. A number of people from health sciences, other sciences were well represented, but we had definitely had subjects across the board. Okay, one of the things that came up a number of times when we were planning the survey was about quality and how do people assess quality of their journal. So we asked a couple questions about the peer review process and how articles were accepted. This slide we thought was interesting when we were looking at both different kinds of peer review, but we were also a little bit surprised to see that there were still a decent number of journals that said we accept all manuscripts within a particular subject area. We asked about tracking impact. A number, sort of surprising number to us, said we just don't track impact. The rest of the methods for tracking impact were pretty common, pretty standard: citations, people commenting on websites, page views, page ranks, downloads. We asked about print and online access, different variations of both of those, if journals were offering print for a fee or for free, online for free or for a fee. It's kind of an interesting mix. I'm just going to go through a couple of these pretty quickly. We did ask about permission to deposit articles or manuscripts into repositories, what versions were the default, and what versions were offered if authors requested it. We were pleasantly surprised to see that most people knew what the answers were for whatever variation. We were a little bit surprised to see that the number of journals that were offering immediate download for the final typeset version was high. Most of the journals that are publishing are affiliated with the university in some way. Several are also scholarly professional societies. That was pretty much what we expected. And a good number that are working with a commercial publishing company in some form or another. Okay, this slide is definitely worth going back to later on when you have a little bit of time, but there are some interesting tidbits sort of buried in here about sources of funding. We were curious to see which journals or how many journals were operating with some sources of funding and income versus no sources of funding and income. Most had some sources of funding and income. Author fees and APCs were pretty high and very important for a number of journals. Print institutional subscriptions fairly high also. And this sort of gets into one of the dichotomies that showed up, which was about the journals which are still really determined to hold on to print, even if it's costing them quite a bit to do it. And we saw that come up a number of times in comments, and Susan will talk a little bit more about that. Volunteer time of editors, peer reviewers, and editors-in-chief were cited by many people again and again about how important it was, how critical it was to keep the journal afloat. So this gets into expenses, which is what I was referring to. Under print costs, those who are printing, that was a huge expense for them. And graphic design and typesetting, which is frequently affiliated with that, again, one of the bigger, most significant expenses. I like these two graphs. I think it shows some of the optimism and that was coming through the survey. That even right now, most of the journals, over half, are reporting that they're breaking even, and another 13% were saying that they were generating a surplus. But even more interesting to me was that they're anticipating 3 to 5 years from now, most people were saying that their journals are going to be in business. Only 1% was expecting to no longer be in operation. I don't know that you would see that in North America or in Europe. So we thought that was really exciting. Most of the journals that we had responses from said that they were open access. We haven't gone back to look to see which journals we think are open access, so I'm kind of curious to see that. Of the subscription only, we wanted to highlight that 6 of those that said they were subscription only had been open access at some point in time and had gone to a subscription model, which I thought was interesting. Motivations. Why did you become open access? How important were different factors? The biggest, most important factor was personal belief of either the editorial board or the editor-in-chief. And again, it gets into how critical it is for supporting, having people who were invested in open access or invested in the journal, being able to keep things moving along. I'm going to skip over this one. Susan's going to make a point about ICT skills and broadband access. And this is pretty similar too. So I'm going to hand it over, let Susan talk about some of these.
So this is just some very preliminary ideas of key themes that have come out of the more open-ended narrative responses of the survey. Given that we were so careful not to sort of overemphasize open access, and we made the survey generally about scholarly publishing in Africa, we were a bit surprised about the widespread emphasis that came out of the narrative comments on open access, but we expected to see that there's a lot of complexity in the responses and a lot of complexity in how this is being realized and the impact of it on journals. What we expected to see was borne out by cost recovery in all publishing models being difficult. Many of these countries are characterized by resource scarcity, so that's not surprising. One thing that we expected to see is commentary about low or no specific funding from African governments. There in the graph on non-financial sources of support, you can see some indirect support from governments through public universities, so free use of the internet connection for the journal from the university, or free office space, or whatever. But that came out, very strongly, which was something that we've been hoping to surface. Diminishing research funding was mentioned by quite a few different people. Too little institutional support, financial and other, for the journals. Few subscribers for the journals that are subscription-based. And also authors struggle to afford fees for those that are open access. One other interesting thing is that quite a few of the subscription-based journals are actually charging author fees as well. Also, quantity issues came up a lot. Surprisingly, too many journals was frequently mentioned. And Africa is a huge continent. It's hard to estimate how many journals, but we certainly don't consider AJOL to be a huge number compared to, say, Latin America with tens or hundreds of thousands of journals. But that certainly came out quite strongly. Too few reviewers and too many or too few article submissions. A couple of times people mentioned the notion that researchers are encouraged to publish everything instead of just their significant findings. So too many sort of low quality submissions, and then other journals said too few. Quality issues came out very strongly, of course. Also, perceptions of problems with quality. So what was frequently mentioned was disagreements and issues surrounding, as we expected, problems with the impact factor as a measure of journal quality in developing countries, and bias. Also, a lot of people ascribed perceptions of quality issues or actual problems from a lack of incentives to authors. Wherever you see this green and italicized text, it's actually a direct quote from one of the responses. So, a lack of incentives to authors. Top quality papers will be submitted to European, American, and Australian journals first. This is because the institutions, the universities themselves, and that's their systems encourage that. Prestigious overseas journals instead of journals published from their own contexts. Peer reviewers, it takes up a lot of time in Africa. I wish there could be some way to speed this process. apart from monetary incentives. That is something that we were hoping to surface as well. There are instances of journals that are paying honorariums to their peer reviewers. In the African context, they vehemently say that this does not affect the objectivity of the peer reviewers whatsoever, but it would be probably regarded by the North as being something that is contentious. So that's something different about our context. And editors producing a journal is a lot of work. It's not particularly well rewarded or supported by their institutions. And just another quote, the problem of extremely low output in Africa of quality journal articles does not lie with articles per se, but with the social and cultural systems and people living and working in conditions that are not conducive to high quality work. Some more key themes that came out was that we were working with a huge preponderance of what OASPA calls scholar journals, so just run by a really small editorial board, usually out of a government department or faculty, and by career academics after hours. So as a real labour of love for the most part, and an extreme time shortage. Concerns around skills surfaced in three main areas: novice authors' writing skills, IT skills to support online publishing, and concerns around handover of journals from the founding editor or editorial board to a new group who can take over. So concerns that there weren't young career academics rising up through the systems to be able to be interested and take over that sorts of role, but also what surfaced in the problems of interruption in intended publishing frequency was often because there wasn't a planned or an actual handover of skills and knowledge from the founders to the new group of people running it. Some surprises were tentatively the responses from open access journals were higher than from toll-based. I'm not sure if this means that there are actually more open access journals publishing from Africa than subscription-based. On AJOL, for example, only about a third of the journals we work with are open access. So that was a bit of a surprise. Another surprise was that internet connectivity and ICT infrastructure was mentioned only a couple of times. So it didn't seem terribly important as a consideration for people. We did specifically ask about whether people are familiar with the term predatory open access publishing, and if so, if it's had an impact on the work that they do. There was a fairly low awareness of the concept. There were kind of 3 times as many respondents weren't familiar with the term and did not know about the concept. But of those that did, they said that it had little influence on their practices, except for their sharing and publicizing more explicitly the processes and practices of quality control and peer review that they already have. So then there was also, interestingly, frequent mention of the need for greater collaboration between countries in Africa and throughout the continent. And this also, it's kind of a surprise that the awareness is there, but prior to the advent of the internet and AJOL, a lot of journals were publishing in neighbouring countries, even with the same titles and the same focus and scope, and not knowing about one another. So now there is the opportunity for those to consider amalgamating, becoming stronger regional journals through cooperation. So it's great to note that awareness is growing. Some more surprises from the reviewers. We quite comprehensively invited expert review of our methodology and our actual survey drafts. And most of them said it's too long, but you must add these other really important questions. So it was a very long questionnaire, but you know, those that got past a certain sort of early point seemed to manage to have the commitment and interest and dedication to complete the whole thing. So that was a good sign. And actually several of the respondents thanked us for undertaking the research and are interested in hearing about the outcomes. From correspondence about the survey, one interesting hypothesis came up that I hadn't really heard of before, is that the subscription-based journals in Africa are staying with that closed model to keep low-quality content from being widely assessed. I see somebody nodding. So that's interesting for us, and it was a bit of a surprise. And from respondents, we were kind of surprised, given the challenges that people are facing in publishing on the continent, what a strong sense of overall optimism there was nonetheless about about the future of publishing in Africa, and huge potential for new insights and new original research was mentioned in a couple of different ways. So looking forward, phase 2 of the research we still have to get into towards the end of this year, and that is going to be a process of more in-depth case studies with particularly interesting individual responses from our wider survey. And then we'll publish it, hopefully the whole bang shoot, which will probably be a book. It'll be so long. Sometime maybe the end of the first quarter of next year, or towards halfway through next year. But some ideas going forward. One of the main points of African Journals Online undertaking this research institutionally was to help inform an advocacy strategy for us as an institution about open access in Africa, knowing that there are complexities and differences in the way it's being realized. So that's another stage that we want to get into is looking at that, and probably notably trying to engage with the public sector increasingly on the continent. Something that has been called for from several different avenues is an Africa-wide conference on open access in Africa. A similar thing has been held in Latin America in 2005, the Salvador Statement. It's probably timely for us to consider doing a similar kind of thing from this developing country region. Hopefully we can invite, if we do manage to pull something like that together, hopefully we can invite some colleagues from Latin America and from India as well to come and present on circumstances in their regions. So hopefully that'll come about and then result in an African statement on dedicated public support for research communication, which is sadly lacking in our context. Contexts. I'm always careful to say that because of there being so many. Comparison and collaboration with other developing country regions, I think, is going to be really important for AJOL as an organisation, and also for everybody who's been responding to the survey going forward. So just to link it back to the theme of this particular session at the Publishers for Development Workshop, this quote: "The place of local and regional journals needs more recognition, and these titles are under more pressure than ever in the increasingly globalised and increasingly open access world." So hopefully more information is going to be available on this in due course when we publish. And in the meantime, you're very welcome to come and speak to either Abby or me during the course of today or via email later on. Thanks very much.